Welcome back, everybody, to Theological Table Talk, the official podcast of the Center for Christian Studies, as opposed to the unofficial. I'm Todd Hall, the Associate Director of the Center, and I'm here with Dr. Keith Stanglin, the
PhD.
Director, PhD, the Director of the Center for Christian Studies. And we're glad to get together again today to just have some good discussion and carry on the work that we're doing with the podcast. JCS, our journal, and if you don't subscribe to the journal, you're missing out. It is, I think, one of our premier things, probably the most academic work that we do, but it's a very, very great journal. I think we've got some really good issues. And the forthcoming issue, which by the time this podcast is out will probably be the current issue, is on ministry and ordination. And Keith, you might just talk a little bit about kind of how we come up with topics, and do we spend a lot of time on that, that kind of thing?
Do we spend a lot of time on that? Yeah, we do. The editing the journal, obviously we start out many months in advance planning issues and then commissioning articles. I have to say, I don't know if we've said this in any other setting, but some of these topics suggest themselves based on just practices of the church, and particularly what have been known in some churches as the seven mysteries or sacraments. So going back to our days as editors of the old journal, Christian Studies, we did an issue devoted to baptism, and we're all the articles on that theme, and then another one on the Lord's Supper. So now we have, those were annual journals. Now we publish Journal of Christian Studies 3 times a year. So we have a lot more output. And work, yes. But that's good. And they've been, as you say, I think wonderful so far. But we've been in some of these, not all of these, but some of these working through subjects that aren't quite the same as those other 5 sacraments, what some Protestants early on actually called false sacraments, because they rejected these as sacraments of the church. But even so, we recognize them as important aspects of Christian life and faith and practice. So not all of our issues are related to these practices, but we've done one on that was related to marriage and sexual morality. We've done one on the art of dying, which of course is related to what's known in the Western Church as the last anointing. It used to be called last rites, but it has to do with the final rite of passage in this earthly life. And so we had a great issue on topics just related to death and dying. And so ministry and ordination in the church is one of those practices as well. And so we're doing one that deals with some of those questions. And so this one has a wide range of articles on ministry, and some of those are just about what we call and ordain, or at least appoint elders in churches, even so-called low churches like the Fellowship of Churches of Christ, in which we minister, of course. And so we have a couple of articles on elders, kind of what one article is just the elder's job description. Which could come in handy, I think, in a lot of churches. People are appointed as elders, they're willing to serve, and then they look around and say, okay, now what do we do? Most churches don't have a job description. Well, we have a job description for elders here in Journal of Christian Studies, Volume 2, Issue 3. So the qualities of elders, we've got an article on ministry, just the calling and preparing of ministers in a day when ministry is, I think, in a sort of crisis right now. Not as
Yeah.
many people going into ministry. Churches looking for good ministers. And so how do we encourage people to step up to that responsibility? And then there are 2 or 3 articles that I would just say are more on kind of the theology of ordination. And that's kind of where, and priesthood of believers and what that looks like in different church settings. And then my article sort of fits in there
Yeah.
on the topic of apostolic succession. But that's, yeah, we look for, back to your original question, we look for in the journal topics that each issue is on a topic, and all the articles are relevant to that topic. We're looking for topics that are of practical concern to
Right.
churches, that
Yeah.
aren't just theologically abstruse questions. They are approached theologically and biblically and historically and sociologically and from all those angles. But these are issues that churches are asking about, or we think should be asking about and
Yeah.
addressing.
Yeah.
So we're having conversations that churches need to be having in this journal.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And so if you'd like to subscribe to the journal, we'll have it in the show notes, and you can click on that link and make sure to subscribe, and get all your friends to subscribe, and get everyone you know to subscribe, so that the journal can keep going. And
Yeah.
some people you don't know. I mean, whatever you want to do.
Gift subscriptions, we can do
That's
that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, this one I think is going to be really an interesting issue, just because, if you're in Churches of Christ, you know that there is something of a ministry crisis. Um, and so we that's, I think, heavy on our thinking at the center. It's always been, really, from the genesis of the center. Keith and I started thinking about doing something like this way back in 2016 or so, and thinking about sort of the crisis, not just in ministry, but in theological education. It's just getting so expensive, and how can we help the church have good quality education for ministers that aren't going to take time off of work to go back full time to school, and or can't afford to, or whatever. And so I think this is just one of those aspects that we address. I also want to say, obviously our context is Churches of Christ, and so some of the articles will reflect that. But this one, I came away, as with the others, feeling that it will address whatever ministry context someone is in. And so, I think that a Baptist pastor will find interesting and sort of challenging things in some of the articles. I think that anybody in church leadership anywhere will benefit from reading these articles. I also want to encourage, if you're in ministry, grab a copy of it and give it to your elders. I think, my dad and I used to joke, because he in 2003, I think, agreed to serve as an elder at our congregation, after much cajoling, and with about 7 other guys who all said no at first. And then we got them in the room together and said, "You need to be elders." And they said, "All right, fine. If he'll do it, I'll do it." And so they all signed up to serve.
A pact.
That's right. Yeah. And so that was 2003, and they signed up for a 3-year term. And my dad passed last October of 22, still an elder. So, these guys tend to get sort of stuck in those situations. And, my dad was very much a reader, a studier. He wanted to be a great elder. And so he was always looking for resources that would help him grow. And I think this would be a great one for that.
Yeah,
But
I think that all of our issues, I encourage, ministers, I would say, and people in church leadership are in many ways the primary target audience of the journal. And so I would say, to about every issue,
yeah,
ministers need to be reading this and then giving it to, and signing up your elders for this. So like I know one church that has 11 elders, and they all as a body subscribe to the, we have 11 issues that go to
Yeah.
this eldership every time. But this one in particular, of all of them so far, I would say, yeah, if you're like a minister or even just a church member or teacher listening to this, make sure your elders get a copy of this. Tell them
Yeah.
about it. Send them to our website. This is something you want your elders to be reading.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, so let's talk for a little bit just about your article. I think your article sort of serves as a bridge from these sort of elder and minister focused articles that begin the issue towards sort of the more theological reflection on, you know, ordination and priesthood of believers, those kind of things. And this is yours as a bridge. And I wonder if you might just sort of sketch briefly your sort of the basic argument that you're making in the article.
Yeah. So the article is about apostolic succession, and I sort of jump off and make as my point of departure the line in the Nicene Creed that was revised at Constantinople. So the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed says that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Those are the four adjectives used to describe the church.
Mm.
And so sometimes we might call those attributes or whatever of the church. The church is one, church is holy, it is Catholic, it is apostolic. And it's the last one, apostolic, that I sort of focus in on with this question of apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is not a phrase that's used in most Protestant fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just explain briefly what this is. It's the idea that you have in much of historic Christianity, and so you see this in Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox churches, the Anglican or Episcopal Church, and many other churches that trace their lineage back before the Protestant Reformation. And that is that the people ordained to lead in the church, which are bishops, that's just sort of a transliteration of the Greek word episkopos.
Mm-hmm.
If you say it just right, you can hear bishop, episkopos connection there. Put a C in that sh, and it is just a bringing over into English of that word episkopos. So we get the word episcopal from that. When you see that as a matter of a description of church government or church polity, that just means it's a church that abides by apostolic succession. That is, the church is led by bishops who were ordained by bishops before them. And they trace that lineage of ordination all the way back to the apostles. And so that is apostolic succession. It's also called episcopal succession because it's the succession of bishops down from the apostles to the present day in that respective church. All right.
Okay.
So if the church is apostolic, if it is an apostolic church that we are a part of, the question is, what makes a church or the church apostolic? And the response that those Episcopal, let's say little e Episcopal churches, so I'm including there all of these Roman Catholic, Orthodox, big E Episcopal, Anglican churches. All right. Normally, we might also call these high church fellowships or high church government. Their answer to that question of what makes the church apostolic is that not only does it teach apostolic doctrine, but it has this traceable succession of bishops going all the way back to the apostles, who of course are the ones commissioned by Jesus to preach the gospel. So the idea is they knew the gospel, and then they, sort of in the language of 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul says to Timothy, I'm entrusting this gospel to you. Now you go and entrust this same message and this truth to others who will be able to teach others. So that's a passage that we have found to be important for our ministry in the Center for Christian Studies. But it's taken in those churches as an instruction for specifically ordination, and the ordination of bishops, and passing the faith and really this gift of the Spirit for ministry in the church on to the next generation of bishops. All right, so those churches find it and claim that particular apostolic succession is still essential for being the church today. So that means when it comes to religious authority, these are the people, in most cases men in most of these churches, but these are the ones who are entrusted with the gospel, and so they are the authoritative teachers. It also means that the practices in the church, the sacraments, so baptism, the centrality of the celebration of Eucharist or Lord's Supper, on the Lord's Day assembly, that these things must be administered by the rightly ordained bishop, or else they're not effective sacraments.
Right.
So if the Eucharist is about the blessing of the bread and the cup, and in so doing it is transubstantiated into the body and blood of the Lord, then that doesn't happen outside of this episcopal succession. Okay. So it's a very important matter in these churches. So sorry, so that's all set up.
Right. Yeah.
To say, what is this we're talking about? All right.
Yeah.
So from those perspectives, they would look at a church like the Churches of Christ and other Protestant, more quote unquote low church fellowships, and say, where's your episcopal succession? You can't trace you weren't ordained by a bishop before you. They might ask a church leader. They might say, well, yeah, we were ordained or appointed, but I can't trace that back to the apostles or whatever. Oh, their response would be, then that line of succession was broken. And so this is not the church, at least, either depending on who you're talking to or which church is saying this. They might say you're not the true church because of that, or they may just say you a little more charitably. They would say you're not the fullest expression of the presence of Christ in the sacrament in this church and whatever. So, which is why the Roman Catholic Church, still to this day, at least from Vatican II, in the 1960s, still refuses to call Protestants true churches or recognize their clergy as legitimate. They refer to them maybe as separated brethren, separated churches, that kind of thing, or ecclesial fellowships. So they is one of the terms, something like that, and kind of withhold the language of legitimate church. And one of the main reasons, really, in some ways, the primary reason, is because of this lack of apostolic succession. So I go in this article and just ask the question, look, I'm a guy who really appreciates the excuse me, the early church's interpretation of the doctrine of the church and of other things. And so I'm sympathetic to the historic church on a number of issues. And if we're out of step with the early church and its interpretation of the New Testament, then I think that would be a red flag. That's something that we want to maybe reassess. And so I kind of, in this article, investigate this claim about apostolic succession. I quote from a Vatican II document, Lumen Gentium. It is the dogmatic constitution on the church from Vatican II. This is a Roman Catholic document. And they, of course, in that document reaffirm apostolic succession. And they quote as their authority, their source here from the early church, in addition to some of these New Testament passages, they like to quote from Irenaeus of Lyon and Tertullian of Carthage. These are late 2nd century, and in Tertullian's case, into the early 3rd century church fathers who apparently exalted and upheld apostolic succession. And so other writers do the same thing. And so I quote from another contemporary Roman Catholic, Francis Beckwith, who quotes from and alludes to and just sort of cites as their authority here Irenaeus and Tertullian. So what I do in the article is say, all right, let's go back and look at Irenaeus and Tertullian on apostolic succession, and let's see what they say about it, why it's important, how they see it functioning, and all of that. And so that's what I do. And the result is that Irenaeus and Tertullian, these late 2nd century church fathers, who speak most strongly about apostolic succession of anyone in the 2nd century and early 3rd century. And so these are the people to go to if you want to uphold this doctrine. They're actually not saying what the current or in many ways historic Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches say about this. They're not saying as much about it. All right.
Right.
They don't think quite as strongly about it in this sense. And I'll try to wrap this up here, but
that's good.
What Irenaeus and Tertullian are concerned about is what is the correct apostolic doctrine.
Yeah.
That's what makes, and that's how you can tell, that's the mark or the sign of the true church, where the correct apostolic doctrine and practice is being upheld. So how do you know that? In the 2nd century, you have an abundance, and too much for comfort for most people, an abundance of different interpretations of the gospel that are out there. So Irenaeus is saying something, but you've got Gnostics like Valentinus who are saying something qualitatively different about God and creation and who the true God is and what his intentions are for creation and what salvation looks like and who Jesus Christ is. That's a different podcast episode to talk about that.
Just we should
trust
do that.
me, there's quite a difference there. You've got Marcion, who's saying something yet also different about all of these questions that are fundamental questions. All right. And it comes and the question is, how do you know which is the true and authentic apostolic doctrine? All right. How do you access that? So it's an epistemological question. How do you know which is right here?
Yeah.
And so the answer that Irenaeus gives is, by looking to those churches that have apostolic succession. So what are those churches that were founded by apostles? And we know them and go back all the way to the days of the apostles, and where you had apostles not only establishing them, but maybe ministering or communicating with them for some time period. Who are those ones who did appoint people in those churches and teach them and mentor them in the faith, in this way of Jesus Christ? And we know those churches, and our listeners can probably name them, right? Jerusalem, Antioch. We see those there in the book of Acts. These are early churches that had apostles either founding them or ministering for a length of time in those churches. And then we can add to those Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, Alexandria, and others. All right. So those big churches where apostles were, what do they, you can still access this in the 2nd century. What do those churches teach about these big questions I just brought up about God and creation and Jesus Christ and salvation and everything. What do they teach there? And we know that those bishops who currently serve in those churches, we can trace their lineage back to the apostles. This is no secret.
Yeah.
All right. We have the rolls, the registers of those. And some skeptics will say, well, they just made those up. Well, I don't know if they made them up or not, but that seems, in Irenaeus's case, we're talking about somebody who's 3 links in the chain removed, 2 links removed, really. He's the third from an apostle.
Yeah.
So you still have, through Polycarp to the Apostle John and other witnesses of Jesus. So you have an oral living memory there of this. In Irenaeus embodies that apostolic succession as others do in other churches. So that's his question, is what do those churches teach? And lo and behold, if you start kind of collecting their answers to these fundamental questions, they all teach basically the same thing about these things. And it's something different from what the Gnostics and what Marcion teach on these things. And so that's how you know. Apostolic. So the question is, what does apostolic succession do? It answers that question of where is the apostolic and what is the apostolic deposit of faith? All right. The apostolic gospel that the apostles went out and spread. Well, where do we go and find that? Where those churches are, those apostolic churches. And apostolic succession is the best way to guarantee that. And so for them, it is, and they use this sort of language, it is through apostolic succession that we find apostolic doctrine. And so it's pretty clear in their language for Irenaeus and Tertullian that apostolic succession is a means to an end. The end is, the goal is authenticating this interpretation of the gospel, this doctrine, that it is indeed apostolic. The means is finding out through this succession of bishops. And so it's a means. And that means is, in our day, 1800 years later, plus, dispensable and unnecessary for that end. Why? Because we know through their writings, the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian and their contemporaries, what the content of that gospel was. And why it's authenticated and why it's apostolic, and those other interpretations have less claim to that kind of apostolicity. And so the question is, what makes a church apostolic? Holding to that apostolic doctrine. How do we know what the apostolic doctrine is? Well, it was confirmed by these writers in the 2nd century. It was no secret. The apostolic doctrine was public knowledge, particularly in the churches and in those apostolic churches. It was not a secret, esoteric insight that the Gnostics had. It was a public proclamation of these matters. And it's the same thing we see in the apostolic writings. So the Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letters, all those things that were, guess what, used in the apostolic churches, and of their doctrine that, again, was passed down in those churches. That's a formidable and, I think, persuasive argument in the 2nd century to say, what do these churches here in these places, in these apostolic cities, teach about this? And we're still, within a century of the apostles here, so we can trace back who it was that said these things and taught these things. And look, they're the same in all these places, which you wouldn't have if it were not the correct doctrine. That has less cachet now, 1800 years later, when we know the content of that gospel through those writings.
Thanks to them.
We don't know it through, and I would suggest even those churches that have apostolic succession, what they know of the rule of faith from the 2nd century and what they know from Jesus' life, about Jesus' life and teachings, is not because they got it orally from the bishop before them. No, they get it in the same way you and I do, and that is through these writings that have been preserved. right? No doubt taught to people, taught to us by people in an oral sort of in-person way. We
Yeah.
didn't just open up the Bible and start reading it and become Christians. It was taught to us, and people directed us to the Bible and interpreted it for us and all of those things. So we're part of that tradition, but it's not through a physical lineage of apostolic succession, because
Yeah.
it just doesn't have the importance that it had for any of our churches that it had in the second century. So
Yeah.
the conclusion here is we can be thankful for apostolic succession and what it did in the second century to reveal and point people to and authenticate that correct apostolic doctrine. But its purpose, at least, is not that anymore
Yeah.
in churches. There may be other purposes, there may be other functions, and I'm not saying apostolic succession is wrong and you shouldn't have bishops in the church, but it's Tertullian and Irenaeus are not saying this is what guarantees
Yeah.
The true church is bishops tracing their lineage back to the apostles. It's the doctrine they teach. And so it is a succession of doctrine or a succession of ideas.
Yeah.
Through whatever means they get to us, through the scripture that we can hold in our hands and read, through these traditional interpretations of it, through reading the church fathers on these things. All those things are accessible to any of us.
Yeah.
So I didn't do it briefly, but that's
good.
The summary.
That's really good. People don't have to read your article now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not quoting Irenaeus and Tertullian here. I do there, and you can see
right.
for yourself what these, whether you're skeptical or convinced or whatever in listening to this, you can go back and see it there. You have to subscribe to the journal, though.
You do, or you can purchase a back issue for $20.
That's right. There.
Yeah, so interesting. One thing that I hadn't thought of in prepping for this that you mentioned, but I'm thinking apostolic succession for the Episcopal churches, little e and big E. It goes beyond just finding the deposit of the apostles, right? I mean, there's a sense in which the contemporary apostles, the bishops, also provide authoritative sort of hermeneutic, right? There's it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me from the article that what Irenaeus and Tertullian are trying to do is get to what was it that the apostles taught, and that is central to the church. But what often I think where apostolic succession can go off the rails is now there's that authoritative step for how do we take that doctrine that the apostles taught and then apply it to our particular age and whatever we're living in, and only the apostles' successors can do that. But that's not what they were about, right?
Right. Yeah. You're right. I mean, so this is where theological decision that we talk in theology, that it's a web in some ways, is a metaphor I use to talk about if you tweak something in one on one area, it's going to have repercussions throughout the whole system. So what we're talking about as an open, these are attributes of the church. These are strictly matters of the doctrine of the church or ecclesiology, but they certainly do relate to matters of religious authority as well. So I think you're bringing that out here too. This is an authoritative interpretation of Scripture.
Yeah.
And Scripture does not interpret itself, strictly speaking. It takes a reader to encounter it and interpret it.
Yeah.
And so we know how that can go off the rails also. Right. And so you've got to have, as the Ethiopian asked Philip, he said, how can I understand this? He was reading Isaiah 53. How can I understand this? Which, we've read scriptures where we ask the same thing. How can I understand this unless someone explains it to me?
Right.
So Philip begins to explain it to him. And we need someone who's, rightly trained, and I would say perhaps even ordained to and appointed for that task. So certainly the New Testament recognizes there's an office of teachers that not everyone is called to. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 12 at the end of that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
James says not many should be teachers in James 3:1. So, yeah, there is an office there of authoritative teaching in the church that is necessary. But again, it comes down to where is it could be the spirit of in this gift of ministry, but I don't know why it has to be in a person who can trace his lineage back through handlaying on ceremonies that is the only one privileged to have this gift of ministry. Because when it comes to the content, let's call it intellectual content and the ability to do this interpretative work, they're getting it in the same way we are. And that is through the readings of an interpretation of scripture. It's not coming through some secret oral. It never was secret. Okay. The only reason it was secret is because it was an oral culture. So when the second century church fathers or church leaders of any second century Christian asks the question, what is the authentic gospel? They're not asking that because it was trying to be kept secret. They're asking it because there were competing interpretations and it was not clear. And it was an oral culture. I mean, the New Testament documents had been written by that time, but they were not widespread and the canon was not determined yet. It was still, there was a fluidity about it, at least on the edges of it. And so in an oral culture, that line of succession, I will say, is more important and essential in a way it's not now. So, for example, early Christians were not the only ones who talked about succession. Philosophical schools had the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so, Platonists liked to be able to trace their lineage back to Plato or to whatever philosophical teacher they admired. And they had lines of succession like that. Other religions have this. If you read the Upanishads, Vedic literature, many of those chapters will end with a long paragraph of succession and who the teachers are, all the way back to Brahman. All right. So where you get the ultimate truth. So the idea here is that's important because we want to know that this person's not just making up these things out of thin air. They're sincere and they got this from a true, authentic source. But let's say today we want to know about and whatever it means to practice Platonism. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to go to someone or we're going to do it for ourselves, go to Plato and his writings. And we read through his writings. And then we may read through the writings of his students and those who respected him. And if we like Neoplatonism, we're going to read Plotinus and his interpretations of Plato. But we're not students in that academy, in Athens. And so we're going to access the writings that we have. That would be, I think, more, we're going to get a more authentic Platonism and be able to interpret him and apply him to our context today than if we found some obscure person in Athens or Western Turkey who says, hey, I'm descended from Plato and I can trace my lineage back 2,500 years. I'm not exactly sure that, and we've had this underground academy this whole time or whatever, I'm just not exactly sure that that's going to be a more dependable. I mean, have you heard of the telephone game, right? Where, and you've seen this happen, as the message gets transmitted from one person to another, the more links in the chain, the more risky it is that and more chance that message has been corrupted in some way, unintentionally even. All right. So what we have with these apostolic writings, the New Testament, and their earliest interpreters, when these questions were provable through apostolic succession, what we have is their writings and the ability to go back and not be dependent on the latest link in the chain, but go back to the first and second and third links in the chain.
Yeah.
As Tertullian says, where you go upstream where the water is pure before it's had all the corrupting
Tertullian was a
influences.
restorationist.
He definitely was. Yeah, go to the fountain, go to the spring. All right, and that's an impulse, of course, throughout Western thought in church history, not just in the Restoration movement. That's not to say that there's no value. Again, all of this is not to say there's no value in the continuing apostolic succession.
Of course,
but I'll just say we all are. It's just that we can't trace it. It's an epistemological question of how we would trace it, but we're all descended from the apostles, and that didn't stop heresy from happening in the church. They were descended from the apostles, or even in some of these churches that claim apostolic succession. That didn't stop heresy from happening.
Yeah, I think you make that point actually in the article. At one point, you say, it was Irenaeus, I think, says, even some people who are claiming apostolic succession are not, it's the doctrine that matters. It's not necessarily the teacher that they're following. I thought that was interesting, given that Irenaeus is one of those cited for this particular doctrine.
Yeah.
Well, so I have several other questions, but we can explore some of this maybe at a later date. But I wanted to get into a couple of things that I think are interesting. You're not Roman Catholic. I am not Roman Catholic, so we should caveat with that. But I'm curious as to, there have been points in the history of the church where you've had bishops who have been morally and or doctrinally corrupt. Presumably these bishops were, proceeded in the correct way apostolically. And how does an Episcopal church handle moral and doctrinal corruption among those who have succeeded? I suppose maybe the Donatists would be the earliest example, maybe that I can think of anyway.
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you for prefacing this with I don't speak in any way for the Roman Catholic Church and how they would answer this, but I've done a little reading on this, of course, and we'll try to be fair here, but. With moral questions, certainly apostolic succession is not meant to guarantee in their churches moral perfection or even superiority in any way at all.
Okay.
You're right. The Donatists claimed such in the 4th century, especially in North Africa. This is a group that said the efficacy of the sacraments and of a bishop's ministry is dependent on his moral rectitude. Well, that was very quickly and I think effectively argued against and defeated by Augustine and others who said there is no moral perfection, and if that's what our salvation is dependent on, then that's really bad. So the efficacy of a minister's ministry and whatever it is he's administering, whether it's sacraments or any prayer, anything else, is not dependent on moral rectitude. So all that to say, it shouldn't surprise us when a properly ordained bishop or pastor or elder has a moral failing. All right. Also in those churches, they allow for that, of course. The doctrinal thing, I think, is a little more difficult for them. In general, though, I would say no, it doesn't even guarantee doctrinal in every case, but doctrinal purity. But you have the College of Bishops, right? You have the Synod or Council, when they come together, of course, but also just in any time, even between councils, you have this College of Bishops who can decide these questions. And again, the idea is the Spirit is guiding them, the Holy Spirit is guiding them in these doctrinal questions. And it's not that they're trying to make new doctrine, it's just they're trying to sort of, as you said earlier, apply the timeless gospel to situations and doctrinal questions and moral practices and questions today. And so any one lone stray person going rogue doctrinally, that can happen. All right. And so I think it allows for that. What is more interesting to me is what's happened in the Roman Church, where they have exalted that doctrinal superiority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope.
Right. Yeah.
So there it does get a little more difficult. And especially in speaking of papal infallibility and all that, certainly brings a difficulty there for them. Pope Honorius I, who was a part of the discussions leading up to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which was Constantinople III in 680, 681. He was not at the council, but he was part of the controversy on monothelitism that led up to it. Again, separate podcast. I'm not going to talk about what monothelitism is, but it was a highly debatable and contested issue leading up to that council. Roman Pope Honorius came out on the wrong side of that. He was a monothelite, and that position was condemned at Constantinople III. He was named as one of those who teach that heresy and was properly condemned along with others. So here we have a pope being condemned for heresy. Now, what do Roman Catholics say about that? Well, I mean, there's always there's a little more grace often given to people leading up to but who precede a council's decision about things. So we're a little more generous to Ignatius and Irenaeus in their Trinitarian speculations before the Council of Nicaea. All right. But in this case, this is someone who had access. I mean, he wasn't at the council. He was had died, I believe, before that. But he was a part of that debate. It wasn't like he's a century or two before it. He was part of that debate, and he supported and came out on the wrong side. He came out with the people who ended up being condemned by name in the council. So it's not that there was a new development or something, new language necessary. So I'm not sure you can play that card. They also played the card of, well, when he used this term, he really meant that. And sort of there was a, confusion of language between Latin and Greek, and he wasn't really a monothelite as they were condemned and so forth. That's a possibility. I don't think that's convincing to most intellectual historians.
Yeah.
So you have that's problematic. Even at the time, it was controversial for them to say that. But it's a Greek council. They said it. It wasn't the last time that the Greeks would excommunicate a pope. Which brings me to, you didn't quite ask it this way, but I think a bigger problem for this is just which succession. So let's say that I want to become, let's say I'm convinced by the necessity of apostolic succession, and I want to join a church that preserves that, because that's really what makes the church apostolic. Which succession am I going to be a part of? This one or that one? Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, the Assyrian Church, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. All of these have legitimate claim to apostolic succession, and at the same time excommunicate the others and are not in fellowship with one another, not in full fellowship anyway. So that tells me right there that that is not certainly not sufficient for a sufficient criterion for identifying the true church. It might tell me that that's not as an essential feature as they think it is.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
that you can access the doctrine in some other way than apostolic succession. It's not guaranteed the unity of the church.
Right. Yeah. I think, and maybe that's what I will close us with in terms of discussing. This is a bit off topic, but you start the article, as you said earlier, with the quote from the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. We believe in one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And I think that, it's interesting. Higher church Protestants have probably always incorporated the creed. But I've noticed to some extent that even one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church defining itself over against heretics, right? Um, in what sense, in our own day, in a time where there are thousands of denominations, and even since the Great Schism, and as you point out, there are these other Episcopal churches that have anathematized one another. Can we speak of a Catholic Church if Protestants want to appropriate the creed? I mean, to some extent, even if Roman Catholics or Orthodox want to say the creed, does Catholic mean anything at all in that kind of context? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, first, there are churches I know of, even Churches of Christ, who recite the Apostles' Creed, which is different from this.
Yeah.
It does not say one holy Catholic apostolic, but it does say, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church.
Right.
So it's got two of those four attributes in the Apostles' Creed. And you see this actually from the Protestant Reformation on, most don't like saying the word Catholic, and will change it to something else. So I
Yeah.
was in a church recently and they said universal there
Right.
for Catholic. But I like what you said at the end there, and that is that it's equally a problem for this is not just a Protestant problem. So we need to understand what the word Catholic means. It just means like the whole or entirety of whatever it is we're talking about. So if it's the Catholic Church, little c Catholic, it's just a word that was used first by Ignatius in the 110s. So it's a very old word used to describe the church that just has to do with the entirety of the church. It's a little bit hard to translate. Universal is probably a good translation, but the idea is that there's a unity that transcends time and space.
Yeah. Is that what Paul is appealing to kind of when he says, if anyone wants to argue this, we know of no other practice and neither does any other church, right? So it's kind of
Yeah, I
it's
think that
universal.
principle is there, right? Exactly, in First Corinthians and also in Ephesians, where you get
Mm,
this sense of the church that transcends space and time. It's not just located here in this time and place.
mm,
So it's a word that's biblical in that sense. It's not a New Testament word per se, but the concept that it means to convey is certainly biblical. And so I would support the use of that word. But it's not, from the Protestant point of view, at least historically, it's not that the Protestants aren't the Catholic Church.
right.
Protestants didn't start the schism. I mean, these are historical and theological questions that have been debated for a long time. I'm just saying what the Protestant claim is that it was the Pope in the 16th century who refused to reform, who
Hmm.
refused questions about doctrines and practices in the church, who excommunicated Luther, that started the schism. So if you asked a Protestant in the 16th century, where is the Catholic Church? They would say, it's here in Wittenberg, it's here in Geneva, it's here in Zurich, or
Mm,
whatever else. It's not in Rome,
mm,
where the Pope is. He is the one, and his fellowship is the one that's being schismatic here. So all that to say, it's equally problematic, yeah, for anybody who recognizes the situation in Christianity to say Catholic here, or one. So all four of those attributes we could have a look at and say, actually, churches today, especially maybe Protestant churches, have shied away from all four of those things.
Yeah.
The oneness, again, is similar in some ways to Catholicity there. Holy, when's the last time that people talked about saints in the church, in the pews,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
talked about the church being holy? I mean, that doesn't communicate to people now. It's not very attractive. So we want to be, talk about how imperfect we are, and
Yeah.
just like everybody else, and whatever. Um, okay, but that's not holiness that we're called to. And apostolic is sort of language that we've lost in a lot of
Yeah.
Protestant churches. So just to say those words, I think, on a regular basis would be something that kind of puts before us what the church is supposed to be. But we have a problem with all four of them.
Yeah.
And I'm getting to your question now. And my answer is I don't have an answer to
Yeah.
that. It's a very difficult issue. And in some ways, we want to see it in, I don't know, start making distinctions between the visible and invisible church, that there's a reality here, again, that transcends time and space, where the church is actually one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, or it's an eschatological reality that will one day again, when the kingdom fully comes, be realized. But that's not what the creed is saying. It's saying it is
Right.
now these things, or at least I believe in them and acknowledge them, confess them. At the very least, maybe it's a goal toward which we should work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to say them, even if it seems contrary to fact, is a step in the right direction. But it's certainly a problem. It's in some ways an unsolvable problem. Now, if I think the way to get to it and is to think about these sorts of denominations as uh, voluntary separations.
Yeah.
The language in these churches, and it's hard to know how many churches and Christians actually think this way. You know, there's a sectarian spirit out there still, of course, but what unites us is, I think, more important than, in many cases, than what divides us when we're talking about sort of little o Orthodox Christian churches that
Yeah.
are out there that may disagree about something like apostolic succession, but see in the succession of ideas that we have here common share and unity in these things. And so, sort of like the segregate, let's say, racial segregation that happens at churches now is, for the most part, with maybe few exceptions that I have heard of, for the most part, this is a voluntary kind of
Right.
segregation. This
Yeah.
is the style we like, or this is this is the kind of worship style we're comfortable with, and the people we know, and the people who are like us, or whatever. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not making an assessment, but I'm just saying people are welcome at those churches. That's not a condemnation of the churches that are
Yeah.
different than you, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, there's a oneness there, even in congregation, the reality of congregational separation.
Yeah. That's
I'm
interesting.
not saying that's where we are when it comes to Christianity at large, but
Yeah.
maybe that we're getting there. Maybe that's where we need to be. And that's what we can mean when we talk about the one Catholic Church. But we have a long way to go. I can't, those are just some thoughts. I can't
No, that's great.
really solve it.
Yeah. Well, we've solved all that. That's good.
Yeah, that's
Only took 1,000 years. It's all good.
good as we're going to get. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this. And I really am, I just want to encourage listeners, if you haven't subscribed to the journal, make sure you do. This kind of content. We'll have another podcast soon, I'm sure, with other contributors from this issue. We've got some great practical articles in this one, but we have also, just like Keith's and the articles that follow it, I think will be really challenging for you in a good way. They'll stretch you. And that's the kind of thing we try to do with the journal. So enter into that conversation with us.
Yep.
Keith, thanks for today. I'm going to let you take us out.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just add that what we're doing with this in some ways is overlapping with that one journal article, of course. And as you said, we'll do that with others. It's just a supplement to that journal article. So
Yeah.
if you're reading through the journal and you see that, and then you see the podcast on it, we're hitting similar issues, doing it in a, obviously dialogue kind of format here. So hopefully it's a little more accessible. Or if you think, oh, there's an article I'd like to read, I'm not sure if I know how to tackle this yet, then try this podcast episode, and now I think the table is set for reading the article. But yeah, I want to thank all of you listeners for engaging this episode of Theological Table Talk, and certainly invite you to follow or subscribe to Theological Table Talk on Spotify or Apple. It's also available on our Center for Christian Studies YouTube channel, all of our episodes. So if you have topics that you'd like to suggest or guests that you think that we should have on here or be talking to, email us at info@christian-studies.org. And you can engage us that way. Also, I invite you to check out our website, christian-studies.org, and see all the resources that we offer. If you like what you see on the website or you like what you've heard here, just hit that give button that you find on our website and help us continue to provide these good resources. Well, thanks for joining us at the table for Theological Table Talk.